To understand our world, we must look through the lens of why.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're taking a really close clinical look at a topic that, honestly, is usually shrouded in a lot of misunderstanding and fear. Today, we're demystifying the exact, precise mechanics of suicidal despair. But we aren't just going to sit here and look at the problem, right? We're exploring the specific, evidence-based clinical overrides that literally save lives. Because look, by understanding exactly how a psychological crisis functions in the brain, we can figure out exactly how to dismantle it.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. 1. The anatomy of despair. 2. The suicide mode trap. 3. Reprogramming with CBT. 4. Building a hope box. And 5. Restricting lethal means.
Part 1. The anatomy of despair. To really understand suicide risk, researchers rely on what's called the stress diathesis model. Think of it kind of like a collision. On one side, you've got your stressors. These can be internal, like a psychiatric illness, which, by the way, is present in about 90% of cases, or they can be external, like really severe life events. Now, on the other side, you have the diathesis. That's just clinical speak for an individual's underlying vulnerability. This vulnerability involves a heightened sense of emotional distress, distorted social cognition, and crucially, an impaired capacity for problem solving. So when a massive life stressor violently crashes into that impaired problem-solving capacity, that's when you get a seriously heightened risk of a crisis. Now you might be thinking, well, isn't it just depression? Society almost immediately points to depression when we think about suicide risk. And sure, major depression is a very common internal stressor, absolutely. But the clinical data reveals this fascinating, crucial distinction. Studies consistently prove that hopelessness, rather than just depression itself, is actually the strongest, most consistent predictor of a suicidal crisis. It's that profound, heavy belief that things simply cannot get better. That is what truly escalates the danger. Moving on to part 2, the suicide mode trap. When a person's underlying vulnerabilities mixed with overwhelming emotional distress, it severely compromises their ability to think adaptively. And the real tragedy here, it's a crisis of logic. To a mind laboring under this incredibly heavy burden, suicide stops looking like a symptom of an illness, and tragically, dangerously, it begins to look like a totally rational solution to unsolvable problems. This whole idea builds on a really revolutionary framework established by Dr. Aaron Beck way back in 1979. He proposed something radical. Suicidal behavior needs to be viewed and treated as the primary problem itself, not just a symptom of something else. He called this the suicide mode. It's basically a distinct neurological trap. The key takeaway for us here is that the suicide mode operates totally independently of other psychiatric diagnoses. It's its own acute state, and clinicians have to target and disarm it directly. So, how exactly does a mind fall into this trap? Well, it's remarkably mechanical. First, you have a distal activating event. This might be something that happened months ago. That triggers an affective response, a deep, immediate emotional reaction. That emotion then starts generating key automatic thoughts. This is the internal dialogue, usually rooted in that severe hopelessness we just talked about. Finally, a proximal activating event hits. That's the acute trigger that springs the trap and sets off the fully activated suicide mode. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what that timeline looks like in the real world. Say, 4.5 months ago, a spouse moves away with the kids. That's the distal event. The immediate effective response? Anger. Then the key automatic thought kicks in, something like, I never thought it would come to this. Then, months down the line, the proximal event hits. Maybe a commander heavily reprimands the individual at work. Immediately, those automatic thoughts cascade into, I'm helpless, and maybe it would just be easier if I ended it. The trap completely springs shut. Section 3, Reprogramming with CBT. Cognitive behavioral therapy for suicide prevention, or CBT-SP for short, finds its conceptual roots right back with its pioneer, Dr. Aaron Beck. Now, CBT-SP is what we call an adjunctive treatment, meaning it works alongside other therapies, but it's very brief and incredibly focused, usually just 10 to 16 sessions. The goal here isn't to somehow cure a lifelong psychiatric illness in a few weeks. The goal is laser-focused, target that problematic coping behavior and dismantle the suicide mode. So how does that actually work in practice? Researchers hypothesize a 3-step mechanism of action. Step 1, deactivation of the suicide mode. Basically, turn off the blaring alarm. Step 2, modification of the structure and content of that mode. This means actively challenging those automatic thoughts of helplessness and worthlessness. And finally, step 3, construction of adaptive structural modes. Simply put,
the clinician and the patient team up to systematically disarm that neurological trap and actively build new neural pathways that promote a genuine desire to live.
Section 4. Building a hope box. All right, so what goes into a hope box? It's pretty much exactly what it sounds like, and it is entirely customized to the individual patient. We're talking pictures of loved ones, a favorite poem, maybe a prayer, or physical reminders of past achievements. The Department of Veterans Affairs even has a virtual hope box smartphone app. The whole point of this collection is to directly challenge those maladaptive thoughts during moments of extreme distress. It floods the patient's senses with concrete, undeniable reminders of past successes, positive experiences, and real reasons for living. And a really crucial component inside that hope box are coping cards. These are little wallet-sized note cards that the patient and practitioner create together during their CBT sessions. You can think of them as a psychological circuit breaker. See, when the suicide mode activates and the brain's problem-solving capacity just plummets, the patient doesn't have to scramble to invent a solution from scratch. They just pull out their coping card. It's this easily accessible way to immediately jumpstart adaptive thinking right at the exact second the crisis hits. Section 5. Restricting lethal means. Now this brings us to one of the most critical public health questions we can possibly ask. We already know the suicide mode can activate rapidly and fiercely. But what happens if, in that acute, very brief window of compromised logic, the lethal means to actually act on those thoughts simply aren't available? Well, the global data gives us a very clear, very undeniable answer. Restricting access to the most available lethal means directly and dramatically lowers overall suicide rates. Take Sri Lanka, for example. Pesticides were a very common method there, but implementing centralized lock storage and restricting access to highly toxic chemicals led to a massive reduction in suicide rates. Now, looking at the United States, the data shows that firearms are used in half of all suicides. Because of this reality, public health evidence strongly emphasizes that education and safe storage programs are absolutely critical to preventing loss of life during that acute crisis window. This brings us to a huge misconception. A lot of folks assume that if you restrict one method, a person in crisis is just going to go out and find another. But the scientific data completely shatters that idea. Method substitution is largely a myth. Surprisingly, when faced with absolutely no access to their immediate, chosen method, whether that's a firearm, toxic gas, or pesticides, most individuals do not turn to alternative means. The crisis window is incredibly brief. If that immediate lethal option isn't right there, the crisis very often passes without the person finding another way to act. Time literally is life. And this data is so robust, so proven, that the World Health Organization makes it a foundational pillar of their worldwide prevention strategy. Through their Live Life initiative, the WHO highlights limiting access to the means of suicide as one of their 4 core evidence-based interventions for saving lives globally. It's a proven systemic safety net. Which leaves us with a final, vital thought to consider as we wrap up today's explainer. We've seen the underlying anatomy of despair. We've walked through the mechanics of the suicide mode trap, and we've looked at the incredibly effective clinical and systemic tools we have to fight it. So what does this all mean for us? How can we shift our collective focus? How do we stop viewing suicide merely as this fatalistic, inevitable tragedy and start treating it as what the science proves it to be, an understandable, highly treatable, and entirely preventable clinical trap? The tools for survival are out there. Now it's just about making sure they're understood and deployed. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. And
Why settle for shallow facts? Join the intellectual rebellion. Subscribe to Why Lens now.